Okay, I have 7:30, and what can I say? I'm just neurotic about starting and ending on time. My name is Lucian Ellington, and it's a pleasure to, on behalf of the Center for Reflective Citizenship at UTC and many supporters, to be in the first sort of quasi-normal Constitution Day since COVID. Last year we weren't able to be in this facility, and so welcome. And the Center for Reflective Citizenship is a unit of the College of Health, Education, and Professional Studies, and we work with a variety of educators, but the general public as well, to further democratic conversations and an understanding of U.S. history and civics. And this is our 11th annual Constitution Day. 2 years ago, we renamed, because of the inspiration of a person I'll mention in a few minutes, but we renamed Constitution Day to the Dr. Richard Grietzmacher Constitution Day. Some of you who knew Dick Grietzmacher remember that he was a valued member of the UTC staff, administration, and faculty. He was director of institutional research. He was a person of great character and an inspiration to many of us. And his passion was American history and government. And he started his career as a junior high school history and government teacher. And so in honor of Dr. Grietzmacher, I would ask, I know we have at least 2 Grietzmachers in the house, if Gay, his wife, would stand, and Hal, and we thank you for what you've done for us. And then I mentioned, and I'll just introduce her now and go non-linear for me. One of the reasons there is a Center for Reflective Citizenship is our dean in the College of Health, Education, and Professional Studies, Valerie Rutledge, has been a long-time member of the Freedoms Foundation, the Valley Forge. She has a passion for history and civic education, and I'd like to recognize her because she supported us. And if you would stand, Valerie. She supported us for years, helped to get the administration to approve the center. And a little, for those of you who haven't been to a Constitution Day, a little history on it. In 2004, by a bipartisan act of Congress, signed by the President, the time around September 17th, 1787, that's when the delegates at the Philadelphia Convention signed the Constitution. So now that it went on to be ratified, we look upon it as the Constitution's birthday. So we're around that date. So that's good. But it was really because of the quality of the speaker that we didn't want to do it on a Friday night, because those usually don't attract people or live streamers. But that's a bit of history about Constitution Day, and all over the nation. If federal funds are received, there are various educational events concerning the Constitution. I want to just take a few moments, in addition to Dean Rutledge, to thank some of our other supporters. And Professor Claudia Williamson, who's here, is the Scott L. Probasco Chair of Free Enterprise, and she was gracious enough to help support this activity. If Claudia could stand, because she's relatively a newcomer on campus, I thank you for acknowledging her. And there are no official representatives here, but this is also supported by the Jack C. Miller Center for the Teaching of American Founding and Principles. which is a stellar educational organization, and we've had their support before, and we appreciate it. We appreciate it again. I want to also mention, before I introduce the speaker, and one person is going to be late because she's at a Medal of Honor meeting tonight, but I certainly want to recognize our UTC Center for Reflective Citizenship faculty fellows, because we use them and work with them to promote Constitution Day, and they're outstanding educators in their own right. So I know Pam Fields is in the house, Mike Brakey, Linda Mines is coming. If you would stand, because we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for both of you and several other supporters. And I would also be very much remiss if I didn't ask my wife to stand, Charlotte Ellington. She's in the back, but Charlotte works faithfully with the Freedom's Foundation of Valley Forge, and she's incredibly interested in civic and history education herself. And I probably have missed someone, but I'm close enough to many of you. Call me out if I didn't thank someone that needed to be thanked. Okay, let me, before I introduce Professor Morrell, let me just give you an overview of the evening. He'll have the floor in minutes, and he will make a presentation on Lincoln that I'll mention again in a moment. When he finishes the presentation, we'll have at least 20 minutes for Q&A, and we've got microphones that I'm going to trust my sound people work, or a microphone, and just come down and ask questions, and I'll moderate that portion, and you can ask critical questions, you can ask inquisitive questions if that's not a redundancy, but the only thing we ask you to do is not make a speech. If you do that, then I'll have to cut you off. But we've had robust discussions with past Constitution Day speakers, and this has been a big part of that portion of the program. Okay, and I'll get to the program now. And the title tonight is Lincoln, the Founding and an America Worth Saving. And because you might not have complete information about Professor Morrell, I'll take just a few moments to share some of his accomplishments with you. Lucas Morrell is the John Boardman Junior Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He also teaches in the Master's program in American History and Government at Ashland University in Ohio, and conducts high school teacher workshops for the Jack Miller Center. That's how Lucas and I, as an aside, met. We worked in an institute in Oklahoma together. Yeah, and he is a Lincoln Scholar. He has done a number of things regarding Lincoln, and most recently published Lincoln in the American Founding. And I'd highly recommend the book. He has a couple of other books on Lincoln. He has a book on Ralph Ellison, and in other activities he's engaged in include, he's former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, consultant for the Library of Congress, exhibits on Lincoln in the Civil War, was a member of the Scholarly Board of Advisors for the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and currently serves, and this was a vocabulary building moment for me, on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which is a national commission of scholars that will commemorate the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. And so before I possibly butcher another word, let me turn it over to you, Lucas.
Thank you, Professor Ellington. University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. My wife was born in Chattanooga, and it's astonishing that I've never come through this town. I've come through Tennessee many times because she grew up in Texas. I grew up in California, as you can tell by my accent. But I appreciate actually getting to see your city amidst the rain.
You can take your mask off.
Oh, yay! Liberation. All right. Thank you for that reminder. At any rate, we've just never taken the time to come through and actually stop in Chattanooga, and so what little I've seen of it is gorgeous amidst the rain, as I mentioned earlier, so I appreciate the invitation to speak about my favorite subject, which was Lincoln. Last year I published a book entitled Lincoln and the American Founding, and the basic argument of the book is that I don't see a greater influence on Lincoln's statesmanship than the leading men and especially the leading documents of the American Revolution and the early constitutional period. Simply put, if they had bumper stickers for the horse and buggy at the time of Lincoln, his would say, "I heart the American founding." But the idea of getting right with the founders is actually not unique to Lincoln. In fact, the two main alternatives to the Republican Party in that pivotal election year of 1860 and in the ensuing, what historians call secession winter, the two main alternatives to Lincoln both appealed to the founders to justify their respective policies. Northern Democrats supported Lincoln's longtime rival, Illinois Senator Stephen Arnold Douglas. Douglas argued that our revolutionary fathers, as he called them, were indifferent, had a don't-care policy towards the future of slavery in America. Douglas claimed that they endorsed something he called popular sovereignty, which would permit or ban slavery on the basis of local white majorities. He didn't think his position as a United States Senator should have any influence or any authority regarding the spread of slavery into the federal territory. So that was one option, one alternative to Lincoln and the Republican Party in 1860. Southern Democrats rejected Stephen Douglas along with Lincoln, but they rejected Douglas because he would not support a federal slave code for the federal territories to protect the rights, as they understood it, of slave owners to take chattel slaves out west. They thought that they were owed this as a result of that notorious Supreme Court decision in 1857, Dred Scott v. Sanford. So these Democrats, rejecting the Northern Democrats, they went on to secede from the Union of American States. They drew language from the Declaration of Independence in doing so, and then they modeled their Constitution, the Confederate Constitution, after the United States Constitution, with, as you could guess, a few significant changes. James Thornwell of South Carolina insisted that secessionists were, quote, upholding the great principles which our fathers bequeathed and the very liberty with which, or for which, Washington bled and which the heroes of the Revolution achieved. And so the election of 1860, as I see it, was in a very relevant sense a referendum on whose interpretation of the American founders was correct. Near the start of that election year, early 1860, Lincoln exhorted Americans to have faith that right makes might. And he hoped to position the Republican Party, which was fairly new, as the true heirs of the founding. Now, you can't talk about the founding without talking about the founder, and that means George Washington. So in my book, first chapter, I start with the influence that Washington had on Lincoln, Washington's character, his piety, and his indispensable role as a conceiver, a defender, and establisher of American self-government, the very nation of America. It's interesting, in his will, he identifies himself two ways: of Mount Vernon and a citizen of America. He does not mention the Commonwealth of Virginia. He mentions America. He mentions the United States. But for Lincoln, as important as Washington was, more important than a founding man was a founding document, the Declaration of Independence. On the way to his first inauguration as president, Lincoln said that he had never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration. So in Chapter 2, the longest chapter of the book, I explore how Lincoln's political thought was shaped by key principles of the Declaration and, to some extent, its chief draftsman, Thomas Jefferson. If the Declaration spells out the aims or purposes of the American regime, Chapter 3 of my book focuses on the means of American self-government, and these are found in, no surprise, the United States Constitution. I examine why Lincoln preached what he called a reverence for the Constitution and laws. He called that a political religion, as well as the more perfect union of American states that the Constitution established. Now, you can't read the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution and not notice where the Constitution fell short in certain places of the noblest aims of the Declaration. So in Chapter 4 of my book, I turn to what Lincoln learned from the founders' compromises with slavery, the institution that contradicted and undermined the founding experiment in self-government. My final chapter explains Lincoln's understanding of what we call today original intent as a political practice. In short, why follow the founders? This chapter examines how Lincoln understood his own respect for the American founding in light of progress, experience, and the responsibility of each generation to govern themselves under the Constitution, and as Lincoln understood it, in light of the ideals spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln believed that during his contentious times, looking back to the founding could actually help Americans move forward. He did this most famously in his Gettysburg Address, and that speech begins at what he considered the nation's beginning. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. If you do the math, you find that Lincoln takes his audience back not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration of Independence. That is, he takes it back not to the body, but to the soul of the nation. He goes on to explain in the Gettysburg Address that the Civil War, as he saw it, was a test of America's purpose. As he put it, whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In the midst of the fight for the very survival of the United States, a civil war, Lincoln thought the nation would benefit from looking to its past. Americans needed a reminder of why the nation was founded in the first place, and therefore why preserving the nation, keeping the union of American states, was so important. With Americans shooting not at a foreign enemy, but at each other, clearly there was some confusion about the meaning of America. This is why, as president-elect, he called Americans God's almost chosen people. Lincoln believed Americans were undergoing a kind of identity crisis. They were no longer united in their understanding of why their country even existed. What were its highest aims and purposes? So in the middle of a fratricidal war, Lincoln believed that only by returning to the original intentions of the founders could Americans recover their unified purpose as a free people. At Gettysburg, Lincoln exhorted Americans to recommit themselves, to dedicate themselves to the task that remained, to honor the dead who fought at Gettysburg on behalf of the Union by sustaining the effort to preserve the American Union. It was a fight to defend a certain political way of life, what Lincoln called government of the people, by the people, for the people. Recall that Lincoln delivered his most famous speech, I think the most famous speech in American history, in the year of Jubilee, the year of emancipation. Union soldiers and sailors since January 1st of 1863 were now charged by the president to protect the freedom of over 3 million legally freed black people. What Lincoln called a new birth of freedom was directly tied to the old, original birth of freedom, our first Emancipation Proclamation, if you will, the Declaration of Independence. Its central idea that all men are created equal described the natural condition of all human beings. So at Gettysburg, Lincoln didn't announce a new principle of freedom, but he affirmed an old one he learned from the Founding Fathers when they declared independence. Lincoln never sought to discover new rights for a new age. He never spoke of what we like to call today a living constitution, one where a visionary few would discern what would benefit the many. Instead, he spoke of what he called the unfinished work to which the living, all the American people, could dedicate themselves. In this way, they could honor the men who fought and died at Gettysburg, those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. This was not a Civil War epiphany of Lincoln's. In February 1861, as he headed to the nation's capital to be inaugurated as president, he stopped in Trenton, the capital of New Jersey, where he was hosted by the state Senate, a majority of whom did not vote for him. "I'm exceedingly anxious," said Lincoln, "that this Union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made. A nation devoted to the equal rights of every person is a nation worthy of the saving." Our temptation today is to think that everything new is by definition improved. But in Lincoln's time, there were some Americans arguing for something new, what they considered an improvement over the American founders. And these Americans rejected what Lincoln considered the original idea of American independence. Consider Alexander Stephens of Georgia, a former Whig colleague of Lincoln's during Lincoln's sole term in Congress, 1847 to 1849. As the vice president of the Confederates of America, Stephens argued that their Constitution was better than the old one Lincoln was trying to preserve. He thought it was better not simply because it protected slavery by mentioning it explicitly, where the original Constitution never used the word. There were plenty of regimes throughout human history that practiced slavery, but Stephens argued that the Confederacy was the first to base its slave society on a racial principle, white supremacy. Stephens said that the American founders believed, quote, that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, politically. However, he praised the Confederate Constitution because it was, quote, founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, Stephens declared, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Stephens added, "This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Stephens argued that the anti-slavery principles of the founding, in his words, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This he called an error, a sandy foundation, unlike the new and improved Constitution he helped draft for the new Confederate States of America. Nevertheless, in the decade leading up to the Civil War, Lincoln's main political target was not slave-owning Southerners, but complacent white Northerners, especially those led by Senator Stephen Douglas. Lincoln criticized Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty because it was explicitly neutral on the subject of slavery. Douglas, as I mentioned earlier, believed that whites at the local level, whether in the states or the federal territories, they had the right to decide the question without interference from Congress. In other words, whether slavery would expand or diminish in the United States under Douglas's definition of popular sovereignty would be determined not by a majority of all Americans, but by a very small majority of the settlers who went to live in the Western territories. In reference to the enslavement of black people out west, Douglas said, "I don't care whether it be voted up or down." This indicated to Lincoln that the greatest obstacle to reducing slavery in the United States was Douglas teaching white Northerners to become indifferent to the plight of black people in the federal territories. As Lincoln put it, "They tell us that they desire the people of a territory to vote slavery out or in as they please. The question arises, slavery or freedom? Caring nothing about it, they let it come in. And that is the end of it. It is the surest way of nationalizing slavery. Just as certain, but more dangerous because more insidious. Because it is leading us there just as certainly and as surely as Jeff Davis himself would have us go." So what made Douglas's don't care policy in the territories so insidious, pretty strong word for Lincoln, was that for slavery to become national, watch this, no politician north of the Mason-Dixon line would actually have to make an argument for racial slavery. Following Douglas, simply get white Americans in the free states not to care if black slavery expanded into federal territory. Once slavery was accepted there as a constitutional right, Lincoln said in the not too distant future, it would become legal in all the states, regardless of what their laws or constitution said. In his debates with Douglas in '58, Lincoln warned that popular sovereignty, coupled with the recent Dred Scott decision in '57, would produce precisely this outcome. Remarkably, in Illinois, where blacks possessed very few civil rights and no political rights, Lincoln consistently stood up for their possession of natural rights. Where Douglas was emphatic in reading black people out of the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln believed it included them in principle. It included them, it included all people everywhere. Tempted by Douglas to stray from its original commitment to human equality, America was becoming a country in the late 1850s that Lincoln could not recognize. So he called upon our ancient faith, as he put it, to guide the country back to its noblest ideals and practices. Looking back to the founders couldn't have been more relevant to the nation, to the crisis that that nation faced in the mid to late 1850s. But as I mentioned earlier, appealing to the founders was something Senator Douglas also did. He was not only Lincoln's rival, his nemesis, but the leading Democrat and therefore the leading politician of the 1850s. He claimed he knew better than Lincoln what the founders thought about the question of slavery, how to deal with it. Douglas claimed his policy aligned more closely with the founders' intentions for the new republic. In Lincoln's mind, the future of freedom and the eventual demise of slavery depended on whose reading of the founders was correct and could best unite a divided country. Lincoln argued that at the founding of the United States, slavery was viewed and treated as a necessary evil, his phrase. But it had become, in the slaveholding states, to quote South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, a positive good. The founders also agreed that where slavery already existed in the states, Congress would have no authority over the institution because of the federal nature of the Union, the federal nature of the Constitution. Slavery was known as a domestic institution, and that meant it was governed principally by state authority. Since the beginning, since the founding of the United States, the power of government, in fact, the powers of government were divided between the state governments and the national government. Because slavery existed prior to the formation of the United States, it remained a state institution. So if the states themselves didn't abolish it, it could not be abolished by Congress short of a constitutional amendment. With the population in America growing faster in the free states than in the slaveholding states, the future of slavery in America, which is another way of saying the future of freedom in America, would be decided by the votes of white Northerners. Lincoln believed that Congress did have authority to ban slavery in the only land possessed by the American people at large, and that was the federal territories. But tempted by Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty, slavery's fate might be determined not by moral right, but by mere self-interest, meaning those who could profit by taking black slaves into the territories. But if white Northerners agreed with Douglas that Congress did not have authority to regulate the domestic affairs of the territories, then Douglas's declared indifference would actually represent, in Lincoln's words, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. And so Lincoln was at pains to tie the future security of the rights of white people to the present insecurity of the rights of black people. Those same white Americans would have to decide if what happened to people who did not look like them, enslaved blacks in the South, potentially being taken into federal territory, had anything to do with the kind of country in which they wanted to live. For Lincoln, the necessary connection could be found not only in the thinking, but also the practice of the American founders. Case in point, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened both territories north of the 3630 parallel to the possibility of slavery, it contradicted the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And that one had banned slavery from that very territory, except obviously from Missouri. Lincoln pointed out that the founding generation, as well as the generations that followed in the early republic, they had acted to restrict the expansion of slavery in the United States. They did so by banning slavery from the Northwest Territory in 1787 and by stopping the importation of slaves into the United States by law in 1808, the soonest that could happen under the Constitution, all in hopes of putting slavery, as Lincoln said, in course of ultimate extinction. Lincoln lamented how the nation had departed from its original approach to abolishing the pre-existing institution of slavery in a peaceful, gradual manner. And these are Lincoln's words. He said, "The plain, unmistakable spirit of that age towards slavery was hostility to the principle, toleration only by necessity. But now it is to be transformed into a sacred right. Nebraska brings it forth, places it on the high road to extension and perpetuity, little by little, but steadily as man's march to the grave. We have been giving up the old for the new faith." The new faith was Douglas's perversion, his corruption of true popular sovereignty. His was a crude majoritarianism that rejected the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. And it made the rights of black people depend on the arbitrary will of local white majorities. Lincoln rejected this legal positivism, and he preached a return to our ancient faith. As he put it, the faith of the fathers. Lincoln declared, "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution. Let us turn slavery from its claims of moral right back upon its existing legal rights and its arguments of necessity. Let us return it to the position our fathers gave it, and there let it rest in peace." Get the pun. Lincoln charged Americans to readopt the Declaration of Independence. In so doing, they would not, his words, not only have saved the Union, but so saved it as to make and to keep it worthy of saving. That was October of 1854. A country worthy of the saving needed to be a country that limited the spread of slavery as a first step towards its eventual abolition. In short, a don't care policy was not worthy of Lincoln's generation of Americans because it was not worthy in his mind of the founders of the American Republic. In December of 1860, President-elect Abraham Lincoln received a letter from none other than Alexander Stephens, who would soon become, as I mentioned earlier, the Vice President of the Confederacy. Stephens in December wrote to Lincoln, and he asked him before the March 4th inauguration, he asked him to give a speech, quote, to save our common country, end quote. Stevens quoted Proverbs 25, suggesting to Lincoln that a word fitly spoken by you now would be like apples of gold in pictures or frames of silver. This prompted Lincoln to jot a note to himself, a reflection on what he called the philosophical cause of American prosperity. For someone who had long revered the Constitution and saw the union of the American states as essential to the success of the Republic, Lincoln wrote, quote, even these, right, the Constitution and the Union, even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. What was it? He says there is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. And then Lincoln alluded to that proverb that Stevens cited. The assertion of that principle, liberty to all, at that time was the word fitly spoken, which is proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. So in Lincoln's mind, what the country needed from him was not a new word. The nation didn't need a new word from their new president, but old words, words already spoken, in fact, written down by the fathers in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln saw the Declaration's principle of equality, what he translated as liberty to all, the equal rights possessed by all human beings. He saw that as the moral compass of a constitution and union that could otherwise be misinterpreted or broken in pursuit of tyrannical ends. A year before he was elected president, Lincoln was asked to give a speech in Boston upon the anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's birth. Lincoln could not make the trip, but he sent a letter that was essentially an ode to Jefferson's achievement in drafting the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln wrote that, quote, the principles of Jefferson are the definitions and axioms of free society, end quote. For someone who studied Euclid's geometry while in Congress, instead of the Federalist Papers, he was reading a geometry book. Lincoln was referring to the Declaration's principles as the building blocks of democracy. Unfortunately, he acknowledged in this letter, even self-evident truths can be denied and evaded, as was the case when he wrote that letter in 1859. Lincoln said, this is a world of compensations. He who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Alluding to Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, Lincoln observed, quote, those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. These were astounding words for Lincoln, the Republican and former Whig, given the success that states' rights Democrats achieved in donning the mantle of Jefferson, one of the founders of the Democratic Party. But still, Lincoln declared in 1859, all honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. In looking back to Jefferson, Lincoln looked back to a founding generation that put the principles of civil society and legitimate government in writing, principles he believed applied in his day and obligated Americans to renew their commitment to eliminating slavery as fast as circumstances should permit. Lincoln's anti-slavery convictions were the very thing that informed his devotion to the Constitution. Like the founders, Lincoln believed that but for the American Union, there would be no freedom for whites or blacks on American soil. This was no innovation on Lincoln's part, but rather an abiding conviction of most Americans who knew their colonial and revolutionary history. Liberty required political independence from foreign powers. That independence required unity among the American colonies, and to maintain that American Union required that compromises be made, especially regarding slavery. Lincoln said, "I think that was the condition in which we found ourselves when we established this government. We had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties." Time and again, Lincoln's references to the founders centered on how they tried to establish a government based on human equality, but by that very equality imposed upon themselves a moral necessity, an obligation to abolish slavery in a manner consistent with the consent that was the flip side, as I see it, of the equality coin. As he put it late in the war, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. And yet, I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling." His distinction between official duty and personal wish, a distinction he made most famously in his 1862 speech. Actually, it's not a speech, it's a public letter to Horace Greeley before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This distinction, I think, demonstrates most clearly Lincoln's concern that Americans follow the rule of law in their pursuit of justice. With the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation basically already written in his pocket, Lincoln said to Greeley in this public letter, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." In America, Lincoln thought that the means of securing liberty had to be consistent with the end. To emancipate slaves as president in a time of war, Lincoln had to basically turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means. This way, emancipation would not only be an act of justice, but also an act, as the Emancipation Proclamation puts it, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. Lincoln sought to make both his means and his ends a faithful expression of the consent of the American people. Lincoln made a correct view of the founding central to the nation's response to alternative interpretations promoted by influential figures such as Chief Justice Roger Taney and, of course, his nemesis, Senator Stephen Douglas. Unlike Lincoln, Taney and Douglas thought the Declaration was true only for white people. They read it that way to protect the slaveholding founders from charges of hypocrisy. In his Dred Scott speech in 1857, Taney said the following: "The enslaved African race were not intended to be included, formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. For if the language, as understood in that day, would embrace them, the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted." A year later, Stephen Douglas echoed this reading, this interpretation of the Declaration. He said, "If they included Negroes in that term, they were bound as conscientious men that day and that hour, not only to have abolished slavery throughout the land, but to have conferred political rights and privileges on the Negro and elevated him to an equality with the white man. The very fact that they did not shows that they did not understand the language they used to include any but the white race." That's Stephen Douglas. So to make profession and practice consistent at the American founding, thereby making the founders worthy of admiration by subsequent generations, Tawney and Douglas interpreted the founders' profession in light of their practice. Simply put, if the founders didn't immediately free their slaves and make them equal citizens, then they must not have seen Africans as created equal to Englishmen or their descendants. In response to the Dred Scott opinion in this reading of the Declaration, Lincoln commented on the equality principle of the Declaration. He said the founders, quote, did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. Lincoln understood the founders, at least publicly, in their public actions, not as hypocritical politicians, but as prudent revolutionaries. They recognized that circumstances like British opposition, think about when the Declaration was written, British opposition, along with, of course, long-standing prejudice and practice, could impede their attempt to secure rights. Furthermore, Lincoln pointed out that the founders' inaction regarding black slaves in their midst was no different than their inaction towards white citizens in America. Lincoln said they did not at once or ever afterwards actually place all white people on an equality with one another. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which could be familiar to all, revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. Put simply, the founding generation of Americans did not believe that they could both free themselves and free their slaves at the same time. They didn't think that they could do it without hazarding the success both of their political independence and their new way of governing themselves. Lincoln's respect for the American founding, which established a new nation devoted to securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, quoting the preamble here, recognized both the noble end to which the nation was founded and the prudent means adopted to achieve that end. Lincoln, in my estimation, became the greatest defender of the founders, not merely because he fought, commander-in-chief, successfully to preserve the American Union, but also because he explained why America was worth preserving. In looking to the founders, he believed Americans could learn the true principles of self-government and thus find common ground for promoting a common future as a truly free and self-governing people. Lincoln belongs to the ages as a teacher of profound lessons regarding the means and ends of American self-government, as well as the challenge of living as a free people. His speeches and writings in those, Americans today, I think, can learn how exceptional their country is, or at least can be, and therefore why Lincoln called the United States the last best hope of Earth. Thank you. Now I will evade your questions.
You alluded to the fact of Abraham Lincoln's philosophical bent toward natural law. Clearly,
Yes.
He was a master strategician from a political standpoint. I've just always been curious in terms of his faith. How do you think that informed both his philosophy as well as his political aspirations and strategies in reaching the vision that he had?
Yeah, did everybody hear the question? I don't need to repeat it, but it's basically a question about Lincoln's faith, okay? To look to the founders, of course, we see most clearly the Enlightenment thinking laid out in the Declaration of Independence, all that, Locke stuff. And the Declaration is more than Locke, but a lot of Locke is in there actually verbatim. But what about Lincoln's faith? What about Lincoln's religion? That is a long-standing debate among historians and political scientists like myself, because I don't think there's any serious debate that early in Lincoln's life he was a skeptic. He read Voltaire and Volney, was very influenced by those readings of the Bible. And so even though his family in Springfield rented a pew, that was what you did back then, Mary pledged membership, but Lincoln never pledged membership in a church. However, I think in the years leading up to the presidency, and especially during the presidency, it is hard not to see that Lincoln became much more open, and I think persuaded by the traditional doctrines of the Christian faith. Now, that's a contested point. Alan Gelza, who is a close friend of mine, he now teaches at Princeton, for a while, taught at Gettysburg. He wrote Redeemer President, a great biography of Lincoln that's coming out in a reissue fairly soon. We both attend Presbyterian churches, right? We're both Christians and lovers of Lincoln. He does not think Lincoln was a Christian, and I think he was not an orthodox believer, but someone who grew to be much more sympathetic to the claims of the Bible during his presidency. And I would argue, if we had more time, actually in the years leading up to the presidency. Now, did his understanding of the Bible shape how he thought about equality? I think yes. And he talked about, he would refer to Genesis in particular. And he does this, in fact, in his greatest speech, in my opinion, which is the Second Inaugural Address. In that very pivotal third paragraph, good grief, that speech quotes both Old and New Testament. He quotes Matthew verbatim twice, but he makes an allusion to Genesis and says that it's astonishing to him to think that people would actually pray to God to defend, right, taking the fruit of another man's labor. Right? In Genesis 3, we see that the curse of eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, one of the curses was that they would now no longer simply labor, but they were going to toil. In other words, the ground is going to produce thorns. It's going to be by the sweat of their brow. And Lincoln would make reference to that slavery was essentially a way for white Southerners to avoid the curse that all men have suffered for the fall, right? That we all have to toil. You figured out a way to avoid that curse by making others toil for you. Lincoln thought that was strange. He was being euphemistic. And in other places, he talks about the great father of all mankind. There's this great telegram that Lincoln writes, he issues in February of 1862. Very pivotal year in the war, very pivotal year for emancipation. A man was apprehended named Nathaniel Gordon, captain of a slave ship. Hundreds, men, women, and children, destined for enslavement in the United States. Since 1820, right, 1808, we banned the slave trade. In 1820, to put teeth into that law's bite, they equated the foreign slave trade with piracy, whose only punishment was, as they put it back then, hanging by the neck until dead. You had to have that until dead part, right? Capital punishment if you were caught. Everyone who was caught always eluded that. They found a loophole. Lincoln is the only president to have enforced that law to the letter. But what he does with Nathaniel Gordon, he doesn't, and he was petitioned to commute the sentence to life in prison. Not to be pardoned, but life in prison. Okay, look, we're going to put this slave trader out of commission. We don't have to kill him. Just stick him in prison forever, or at least until he dies. Lincoln says, no, not going to do it. But what he does is he gives him 2 weeks. Why does he do that? Because it never occurred to Nathaniel Gordon that he would ever actually be punished for something that no one else ever got punished in the United States for. So what Lincoln says is, having been denied all pardon from human authority, him, that he should now appeal to, as he put it, to the Father of all mankind. He reminds Nathaniel Gordon I know what I'd do if I had 2 weeks. You know, nothing that concentrates the mind like one's imminent death. He says, you know what you ought to do? You need to get right with your Maker. And he doesn't just say, get right with God. He reminds him of the enormity of his crime, the Father of all. In other words, that God who made you in his image, he made those hundreds that you turned into mere commerce in his image as well. You better repent of that before you meet your Creator. So for me, it's hard not to read a telegram like that where he gives him 2 weeks. He postpones the punishment in February for 2 weeks. In a strange way, it's a merciful act for someone he's not going to extend mercy to. He's going to execute him, but he's going to give him 2 weeks to get right with his Maker. You don't learn that from Locke. I always get a question about Lincoln and religion. It doesn't matter what I'm talking about. Was Lincoln a Christian? It's not possible that you agreed with every sentence of my speech. That's a long way. If I hear you, I'll repeat it.
Okay. Re-election of Lincoln. I'm taking advantage of you said you were a Lincoln scholar.
That's what I claim.
Re-election of Lincoln. I just can't believe that 1864, Sherman had just captured Atlanta.
September.
And I can't believe that's the only reason he was re-elected. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, okay. So he mentioned that Sherman, sends Lincoln that wonderful telegraph in early September. Atlanta is ours and fairly won. A real easy one to remember. As late as August of 1864, Lincoln seriously doubts he is going to be reelected. How serious? He actually writes what's known as the blind memorandum. He writes on it that we will have to work to hold on to this country because we know that the next president will not. Right? The fear is that McClellan, when he wins on the Democratic ticket, that he will allow the Confederates to sue for an immediate armistice. McClellan has no interest in enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln, in fact, so he writes this down and he doesn't show his cabinet, but he wants to prove to them, look, I want to tell you, and this is in July, I want to prove to you that when this happens, I knew it was going to happen. And I'm going to do everything I can to hold the Union together because once McClellan is inaugurated, I'm gone, the Emancipation Proclamation is gone. So he has all the members of his cabinet sign this thing. It's called blind because he doesn't let them see what's written on it. In it's either July or August, he invites Frederick Douglass to the White House. And Frederick Douglass was a vociferous critic of Abraham Lincoln during the war. Douglass wanted it to be an abolition war from the jump. Right? And Lincoln refused to turn it into an abolition war the day he became president. We were still at peace in his mind. You know why he brings Douglass to the White House? He says, hey, I'm not going to get reelected. I need to get as many slaves into Union lines and ships as possible before the next president is inaugurated because the Emancipation Proclamation is going to be a dead letter at that point. He meets with Douglass to encourage him to find ways to get the message out and even lead bands south to get slaves north. Almost, as Frederick Douglass says later, it's kind of like a John Brown action there on the part of Lincoln, which is ironic given how much he's a rule of law guy. So that's the context for the letter, or the telegram that he gets from Sherman in September, and at that point on, right, Farragut has the Mississippi all wound up into Union hands. All the ports are in Union hands now. Lee is on the run. Sherman is coming, in your perspective, Sherman is coming up through the Carolinas at that point. Lee's here, basically here. And we've got Grant and Sheridan coming north. The noose is now tightening on Lee, okay? So by the time November rolls around, and we need to hasten to add that, of course, Lincoln, for the first time in American history, enables soldiers to vote in the field. They don't have to return home. And he gets a significant number of votes from federal troops. So these are the guys who are exposing life and limb on behalf of the Union, and they say, he's our guy. Lincoln's our guy. In other words, they want to continue fighting and to get this thing done. Had the momentum not been there, no Sherman telegram, had the war continued to sour, that vote, I think, would have soured for Lincoln. That vote would have turned. Now, again, this was an election where you don't have the 11 seceded states that are participating. So in a way, you could say it made it easier for Lincoln to win. But remember, that year, it was all about, do you believe that the Union is worth preserving, all the states, or not? Remember, the Republican Party nationally did not campaign as the Republican Party in 1864. What was their name? Does anybody remember? Gold Star. I'm handing them out if you know the answer to this. What was the name of the Republican Party in 1864? What? What the? Wait, I'm sorry. What did you say? It was the National Union Party. In other words, the Republicans said, let's not make this a partisan thing, Democrat versus Republican. Let's just call it the way it is. The litmus test is what? Do you think that your current commander-in-chief is doing a decent enough job that you should keep him there? As Lincoln says, don't switch horses midstream. Do you think we should stay with Lincoln and close this war out? Or is it just too much? Nobody expected the war to go this long. It's so devastating. Thousands upon thousands dead, maimed, you name it. Anything is better than more war. The Republican Party made that the issue in 1864. And, you know, there's nothing that succeeds like success. So with Sherman's audacious move through Georgia and then through the Carolinas being successful, and then, of course, what's happening up in my neck of the woods now in Virginia, when the war was going well, Americans said, all right, let's finish this thing with the guy who's already in the saddle. So that's not an atypical reading or interpretation of why Lincoln won the election in '64. I don't have a counterintuitive rationale for that. It seemed to me pretty straightforward. It was a question of how well the military was doing their job. And when there were signs of that, and there were in September, and they weren't, it wasn't the case in August or July earlier that year, that's what turned the tide in his favor. Real easy to get into war. It's hard to sustain them. Cody? Oh, I'm sorry. What? All right, hold that burning question. Sorry.
Clarify a bit how the Emancipation Proclamation worked.
Yes.
It applied only to the southern states and not to the northern states.
Okay.
But there were also slaves still.
Right. Here's the question, could I explain how in Lincoln's mind he intended the Emancipation Proclamation to work? The greatest thing about this is you don't have to read a book, even though my good friend Alan Gelso wrote the best one, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation itself spells out both what it is doing, how it does it, and its rationale. Lincoln did not believe as president he had constitutional authority to touch anybody's property. That's why he didn't free any slaves on March 4th, 1861. That's why in that famous Greeley letter that everybody quotes when they talk about emancipation, he said, if I could save the Union without what? Freeing any slaves. That sounds pretty kind of meh. I thought Lincoln was the great emancipator. Why do you want to save the Union without freeing any slaves? Dude. Well, he said, the American people haven't given me that authority. Not in a time of peace. But what happens, right? By the time he's inaugurated, citizens of 7 states no longer think they're American, Confederate States of America. And then after he calls out the militia in April, after the firing on Fort Sumter by South Carolina, 4 other states decide to join the Confederacy, including Virginia, which voted against secession first time. So now we're in a war footing. And what a commander-in-chief, i.e. what a president can do during a time of war, is different than what he can do in a time of peace. What have we invested a president to do during a time of war? Today, what we refer to as war powers, that phrase doesn't appear in Article 2 of the Constitution, but we understand that to mean what we understand as commander-in-chief. So Lincoln interpreted his role as commander-in-chief, his sworn duty, the only federal officer whose oath is verbatim in the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Those things combined, Lincoln believed, in a time of actual armed rebellion, now I'm quoting the Emancipation Proclamation verbatim, as a fit and necessary war measure. Now I can touch not only the enemy's property, but also what was known at that time, or had come to be known as contraband. What do I do with these enslaved blacks who have left their owners and are fleeing to Union lines and ships? What are we supposed to do? This was a situation that was unprecedented. So Lincoln issues an Emancipation Proclamation that also follows two confiscation acts by Congress, one in 1861 and one in 1862. So in combination with Congress's action and his own understanding of his authority under the Constitution, especially Article 2, Lincoln says, in the same way I can take a farm or a mule or any material that supports the opposition to me in trying to destroy the country, destroy its people, its property, etc., I can act towards what they consider legal property, which is their slaves. And so he only frees by military order. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the very next day he issues a general order. It's called General Order, I think it's General Order number 1. He issues that, which commands his generals to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. And so it only applies in those states and portions of states where citizens are still in active rebellion. So it doesn't apply to Tennessee. Glad you brought that up. Why doesn't it apply to Tennessee? Because Tennessee has already been secured militarily by the Union Army. Gee, who was the military governor of Tennessee? Who was the only senator from a Confederate state that stayed in the Senate? In other words, continued to report to work. Andrew Johnson, thank you. Silver Star, because I started the answer before you started talking. Silver Star? Andrew Johnson, okay, Democrat. It doesn't apply to certain parishes of Louisiana, doesn't apply to certain portions of Virginia that eventually become, let me think of it, West Virginia, yes. And so those exemptions are there precisely because, oh, and of course it doesn't apply to Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. Why? Those are all slave states. None of them seceded. None of them are in rebellion. So according to the Constitution and laws, what must be the president's attitude, that is to say his posture and his authority vis-a-vis those slaves? He must enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So when those slaves, when Benjamin Butler gets these slaves from loyal, at least moderately speaking, loyal states, he has to return those slaves. But when they come from Virginia, he's like, I'm not going to return these guys. Their owners are shooting at us. That would be absurd. And this is what creates the contraband policy, or precipitates the contraband policy. So Lincoln has, why is it that we can memorize the Gettysburg Address and not the Emancipation Proclamation? I think they're both pretty cool. But if you read the Emancipation Proclamation, oh my goodness, it is full of legalese and whereas and the party of the first part, all that kind of stuff, because that thing is not a speech. It's doing real work. Lincoln wondered whether the Emancipation Proclamation would hold up in court. Gee, who's still Chief Justice of the United States? January 1st, 1863. Taney, that Taney guy is alive until October 1864. Lincoln thinks, man, if I get hauled into Supreme Court on the constitutionality of the Emancipation Proclamation, my Attorney General and my lawyers will make an argument for it, but remember what Taney said in the 7-2 decision in Dred Scott? So for Lincoln, more important than the Emancipation Proclamation, honestly, his plan A was not the Emancipation Proclamation. It was to get the loyal slaveholding states to ban slavery themselves, at least adopt a policy of gradual emancipation. You don't have to do it right away. Just show the Confederates you're not joining them in any time in the near future. And none of them would do it. None of them would do it. He made this appeal to Delaware in the fall of 1861. He appealed to all 4 of the loyal slave states in March, and then in July, when he's already got a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, he makes a final appeal. He says, look, we will loan you the money. We will loan you the money to compensate, yes, compensate loyal slave owners for their slaves. Just get this thing done. And they all threw it back, as Gelso puts it. They threw it back in his face. That leads him to announce in what he said to Horace Greeley in August. He's already got the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation written. They persuade Lincoln, don't issue it until we have a significant military victory. That victory was, depending where you live, Antietam or Sharpsburg. Thank you, you guys are good. That happened exactly a month after his public letter to Horace Greeley. September 22nd, he says, hey, on January 1st, I am going to identify those areas of the country that are still in rebellion, which was his carrot to the rebellious states. If they had come back in, Lincoln was essentially saying what? Status quo ante. In other words, I'll treat you the way I'm treating Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. Good?
Thank you.
Thank you. Cody, I was trying to talk a long time so you would forget your question.
No, you just gave me more time to make it harder. The heart of your argument, as I understand it, is that Lincoln was true to the fundamental political philosophy of the founders, the apple and the frame of silver, which
Right.
I agree with. But I wonder what you would make of there's some scholars who argue Lincoln betrayed the founding. I'm thinking of someone like Tom DiLorenzo, who argued that Lincoln embraced various features in his war powers of expansive big government.
Yeah.
Got in bed with corporate interests, was willing to trample on civil liberties and these sorts of things. What do you make of that argument that Lincoln betrays the founders with respect to his embrace of more federal power?
Lincoln was pretty clear during the war that the authority that he had as president would recede once we returned to a peacetime posture. In other words, in a time of war, the Federalist talks about this. Hamilton in Federalist 7 and 8 talks about this, where he says, the problem, in fact, with being at war is precisely that the legislature takes a back seat to the executive. Because in a time of war, you need executive action. You don't need deliberation that takes long, and you need something with teeth, like bullets and bayonets. So it's a problem to be in a time of war if you're a republic. Because in a republic, you want to be a people that are, lex rex, where law is king. You want to be a people that are ruled by, if you will, by words rather than by force. In other words, ruled by deliberation, ruled by law, not ruled by compulsion. This is DiLorenzo is not the first person to make the charge, of course. And by the way, DiLorenzo I believe he's an economic historian. He's not a Civil War historian, but he has published, I think by now, 3 books on Lincoln, which I guarantee you sell way more than anything I write on Lincoln. There's just an audience for that sort of thing. Just the same way Confederate memorabilia vastly outsells Union memorabilia. I mean, I can't tell you the last time I went into a house, I'm like, cool painting of Grant. I've never seen it. I've taught in Arkansas and I've taught in Virginia. And maybe it's because of where I'm teaching, but I see a lot of paintings. They're not wearing blue. Okay? So DiLorenzo is late to this party. DiLorenzo makes this claim that Lincoln is the godfather of big government, that it's because of Lincoln's wartime actions, jailing unpatriotic or highly critical newspaper editors, restricting civil liberties, especially of known copperheads, right? Those Democrats who were not sympathetic to the war. I'll even do you one better. Benjamin Curtis, one of the 2 dissenters in Dred Scott. Dred Scott, in fact, the dissent of Benjamin Curtis, who's from Massachusetts, his dissent in Dred Scott was his swan song on the court. He couldn't work with Taney after that. Taney wouldn't release his opinion to his fellow jurists. And Curtis says, well, we can't work with you then. Benjamin Curtis writes more than one pamphlet called Executive Power, where he condemns Lincoln for trying civilians in military courts, jailing newspaper editors, suspending the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, and issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. When Lincoln finally does that, Curtis says, what? You are violating the Constitution. An executive doesn't have this authority. But to address DiLorenzo's basic point, Lincoln's the reason why we have the administrative state today. Bureaucracy, unelected bureaucrats ruling our lives, regulating our lives. And if you look at the record, if you trace, for example, number of federal employees, if you look at the budget for the federal government, if you look at all the things that we would typically associate, they're very mundane, but if you look at all the things that you would typically associate with the growth of big government, right? You have to say big government that way, the growth of big government. If you look at all those things, if you remove pensions for veterans, the federal budget actually declines precipitously once the war is over. The number of federal officers goes down. So, I mean, if you want to take that argument seriously and do the numbers don't support that case. Now, let's keep it on the level of theory. Well, okay, that's fine. Okay, don't bother me with those facts. But what about just the fact that Lincoln was a benign dictator? In other words, it makes it more easy for people who are less than benign to be dictators in the future. I think Lincoln's own rhetoric, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with him, and you would think Benjamin Curtis would be sympathetic to Lincoln, right? Both he and Lincoln did not like Taney's ruling. He's a New Englander, for crying out loud. What's not to like about Lincoln? If you just look at the general argument that Lincoln was acting like a tyrant, even if you disagree with him, what Lincoln consistently did, and he did this in two particular letters. The Corning letter, Erastus Corning was one, and then another letter, its name escapes me, the person he wrote it to, but essentially he's explaining that the actions that he has taken are all actions that at least he understands are consistent with the Constitution. So, I mean, you'd have to take my class on Lincoln statesmanship where I walk us through this, but at the end of the day, at least with Lincoln, you have someone who doesn't just say, trust me, you elected me, it'll all be well, okay? What he does is he constantly refers us back to the Constitution. Suspension of writ of habeas corpus, he does this in his speech July 4th, 1861, addressed to Congress in special session, where he goes chapter and verse explaining the least controversial things he's been doing when Congress was not in session, to the most controversial thing, and that's suspension of the writ, the habeas corpus one. And Lincoln, what I like is that at least he directs the public gaze to the standard by which his conduct should be judged. How often do we have politicians who do that today? Who say, look, you have a beef with me, let's talk. This is why I think I can do what I can do. In other words, this is how I understand the deliberative will and consent of the American people have been expressed in the Constitution. Here are the powers as I see them laid out, and here's my interpretation of those powers. That's an invitation to a conversation that if ultimately we're like, interesting, nah, then we have ways of dealing with that. Trump was impeached how many times? One term of office? Twice. So, charged with high crimes and misdemeanors in the House, the body most closely, most directly related to the American people, right? 2-year terms, frequent elections, as we call it, but not convicted in the Senate. In other words, if you can't wait till the next election, we even have constitutional means of removing someone where you're like, man, you're doing things that are so bad, we can't wait for the next election. All right. Lincoln would point to those, and he never said, oh, by the way, you can impeach me if you don't like what I'm doing, but he would, in an elliptical way, he would say, the American people have spelled out how to address what I've been doing if they disagree with my understanding of the Constitution. So what I like about Lincoln, and I don't try to get my students to go, oh yeah, I love Lincoln, I don't think he was a tyrant at all. I'm like, what I want them to notice is, what is the character of this tyrant that would continue to refer to the American people in terms of what they have already expressed as the guardrails or the limits within which their rulers must act, whether it's a court, whether it's an executive or a Congress? So at the end of the day, I am satisfied if at least my students go, all right, props to Lincoln at least for shoring up our devotion to this thing we call the Constitution as the thing that's supposed to limit the actions of our rulers. And then we can debate, I don't agree with that interpretation. Or, wow, I am persuaded. That Lincoln's a pretty smart dude. I thought there was another hand over here. No? Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I actually have a question from a live stream viewer, if I could go first. Yeah.
Live stream.
This is from Cy Simmons.
Thank you.
How do you think Reconstruction would have been handled if Lincoln lived?
All right. So I said earlier, I get asked the Lincoln and religion question every speech. That one's a close second. The $64,000 question is, Morrell, you had to bring up Andrew Johnson. The easy answer, and the historians always do this, is like anything would have been better than Johnson. Okay, but I'm sorry, we're talking Lincoln here. That's a pretty low bar. Okay, I think, and this has been my, it's a difficult answer to give in a concise way. So my pat answer that I have developed is the closest idea, no, not closest, the clearest picture we have of what it would have looked like for Lincoln to be president at a time when so many former rebels were just digging their heels in the ground and saying, no, we're not going to be ruled by black people and Republicans who have come south. Sorry, no, not going to do it. The closest thing we have is Grant. And if you want a great biography, there are several good ones. The Chernow one, Ron Chernow's, oh my goodness, I've listened to that. That was one of those where, and it's a tome. It's not a short book. That was a book that when I was done listening to it, I started over. It was that good. I'm like, how do we not know this? That Grant, when the American people had the moral will and the money, in other words, prior to the recession slash depression that happened in Grant's second term, that when there was moral will, and of course where was the greater part of the population, in the North and West, when the moral will and the willingness to use tax dollars to do what? Station federal troops. That's what would have been required. There was no way around it. States that were increasingly coming back into the control of former rebels, they could care, not only did they not care about black people, they terrorized them. Colfax Massacre is just one of many instances where you had anarchy, refusal of local white majorities to do what? Live up to their duty as free, self-governing citizens. And they were unwilling to do that. So local police were not willing to do their jobs when it came to the rights of black people, and local governments that were in control of ex-rebels. So it would have taken federal troops to continue to be stationed in the South, what Southerners refer to as what? Bayonet rule, right? They wanted that. They're like, oh no, we live in a federal society, a federal system. We need home rule. We need to govern ourselves. This is the Republican way, small r. It would have required federal enforcement of federal laws. And it's an interesting question in terms of what would have happened in terms of not a 13th Amendment, because, you know, Daniel Day-Lewis took care of that, but a 14th and 15th Amendment. Those were required because what? Johnson kept vetoing civil rights laws, right? So the short answer is Grant. And he was actually kind of short, so haha. So that's what I think. Reconstruction, it would have. I tell you, man, we were in a bad way at the end of the war. You thought fighting a war was hard? Try winning one. And that's, oh my goodness, invite me back to talk about the second inaugural address. What Lincoln does in that third paragraph, you don't get to malice toward none and charity for all until you go through that third paragraph of that speech where he says, let us suppose, right, that God might be using this war as a scourge for the sin of what kind of slavery? Southern slavery? American slavery. The adjective Lincoln uses is national. It's not a sectional thing. He says the slaves are localized in the southern portion of it, but it's an American institution. He says, you think 4 years and 600, 700,000 people dead is a lot? Try 250 years of unrequited toil. He puts into context the clear devastation that a majority white population suffered as a result of the war. He says, 2 things have come of this war. This is what I would say if you invited me to talk about it. 2 things have come of this war. The Union side won, the Union is preserved, and emancipation has occurred. And by that time, March 1865, 13th Amendment has been passed by the House. It was passed in the Senate the previous year, and it's on its way towards ratification ultimately in December. So what Lincoln is saying is the 4 years might have been bad, but slavery was pretty bad too, and it's been around way longer. These people have been brutalized way longer than we have for 4 years. And he basically says, look, this God you claim you believe in, the believers in a living God, as he puts it, if he can have mercy on you, go and do likewise. With malice toward none, with charity for all. In other words, if you honestly call yourself a Christian, a believer, right? He said both sides believe, read the same Bible and pray to the same God. But unfortunately, they drew a different conclusion as to the legitimacy of slavery. Lincoln said, maybe the best way to understand what happened in this war is that God punished us for the sin of slavery, and that our bearing fruit in keeping with repentance is doing what? Acting like God. There's been enough bloodshed, enough punishment. It isn't full punishment for the sin of slavery, because remember, the war's only gone on for 4 years. Slavery's been around for a quarter of a millennium. So what looks like, even if you read it, and the South saw it as a judgment as well, although they interpreted it differently, even if you look at the war as God's judgment, what Lincoln says, he says, if it continues so that every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. Shakespeare can't improve on that language. Gee, wonder where Lincoln got that language. Shakespeare. Lincoln says, if God were to do that, the war would stretch out. The fact of the matter is, on March 4th, 1865, what's actually happening? Only Jeff Davis thinks the war isn't over. Lee's on the run. They're going to catch him. Black troops are pivotal in trapping Lee at Appomattox. So Lee wants them to see, yeah, this war's been bad. Slavery's pretty bad too, in the eyes of God. Be thankful this war only went 4 years. See it not as simple justice, but also as God's mercy. You don't understand that, you don't take away that lesson from the 3rd paragraph, malice toward none, charity for all is a non sequitur. It comes out of nowhere. It makes no sense. That exhortation is meaningless unless Lincoln shows this is the character of the God you claim to believe in. Go and, what would I say? Go and do likewise. Act like him. That means former slaves and former masters. Are you kidding me? Malice toward none, charity for all? Former rebels, Union soldiers, North, South, West, you name it. Lincoln says there is no way for this country to come out of this war unified and to see each other as fellow Americans unless we have this public memory of what just happened to us. Lincoln doesn't know that's what God is doing, right? The pivot of that speech, again, this is what I would say if you invited me back to talk about it. The pivot of that speech is when he says the Almighty has his own purposes. It's really interesting. Even though Lincoln gives us an account of what God might be doing, he never claims to know, to insist he knows what God's doing. But he says, boy, if we thought about the war this way and the history of slavery in this country that existed before this country was born, Lincoln thinks that's the only way we can enter into his next term reconstructed. Right? The only line about Reconstruction in the whole speech is the last paragraph, which is one sentence, that malice toward none, charity for all sentence. He thinks, forget about the future. We don't have a common understanding of our past. We're doomed. I don't know, who got me onto the second inaugural address? You started it, whoever that was.
I am,
Oh, live stream, your fault.
I'm again, I'm getting ready to conclude the evening, but I'll mention, I'm sure that if you had a question, that Professor Morrell will stay around for
Sure.
at least a few minutes.
Yes, absolutely.
And answer your question. And I just, again, am so grateful as we try to move out of COVID that we had this attendance this year.
In
And
person.
maybe we'll get back to 250 and 300, but you did a great job.
Thank you.
So thanks for coming. Thank you.